can see, we've got a packed house. The way it will run is I will have the pleasure of doing an initial phase of In Conversation. I'll introduce them probably in a second, and then we will open it up to questions from the lovely audience that we have. So do be thinking as we're chatting about questions that you want to ask, and we'll try and get through as many as we possibly can at the end. Just as a slight introduction, I'm sure you all know Reform very well. I'm sure most faces in the room I recognise and are long-standing friends of Reform. It is lovely to see you, and Happy New Year to anyone that I haven't already said that to or I haven't seen yet. We launched a huge new programme towards the end of last year called Reimagining the State, and we've got very big, ambitious plans for that programme, but it's underpinned by two key work streams. One is reimagining health, and one, which is why we're here today, is reimagining Whitehall. I'm delighted also to say that both Philip and Jonathan are members of our steering group for that Whitehall programme. And by Whitehall, there's several people, in fact, I would say one in about every two say to me, what do you mean by Whitehall though? You know, what are you actually encompassing there? So I thought I'd get that out up front, what we mean by Whitehall. And what we mean is, I guess, the kind of civil service that sits within the Whitehall area, the central government departments, and the relationship between those central government departments and institutions with, you know, all of the other institutions that deliver public services, make up the state. But we are distinguishing it from a lot of the kind of frontline public service workers and the public services themselves. We are talking about the functioning of essentially central government and what makes up central government, because we believe if you can't get that right, you're going to struggle to get the rest of it right. And that links to all sorts of questions, including devolution and whether the centre is trying to do too much, which I'm sure we may touch on, as I think that's a topic that our two panellists today are very interested in. So that's a little bit of introduction. I want to actually take a seat now. I have a kind of quiet audience and hopefully slightly rapt audience to hear. I have two former permanent secretaries, obviously not just permanent secretaries, long careers in Westminster and Whitehall and Scotland, in fact, in the case of Philip. Neither of them really require any introduction, but I will just give you a slight kind of bio to give you the depth of experience and insight that hopefully we will be able to get today. So Jonathan, when you exited the civil service, it was as Permanent Secretary of the Department for Education, but I think you were Director General in quite a wide range actually of departments, so Ministry of Defence, Cabinet Office, Ministry of Justice. Am I missing any there? No, there we go. So quite different types of government departments as well there, and also came in from local government. So you have a slightly different perspective than perhaps those who've come up just entirely through the central government machine. And Philip, you exited as Permanent Secretary of DECSU, so a government department that was stood up and then stood back down, so fascinating in terms of the kind of machinery of government that sort of relates to. And obviously you started out in Scottish government, so also some very interesting, I think, perhaps comparisons, differences of experience. You also led in Cabinet Office the constitutional and devolution part of it, and maybe we'll have some interesting observations as to how central government in Whitehall sees that and the importance it applies to it. So huge experience sitting with me this morning. I'm thrilled, thank you so much for giving up your time. So to get straight into it, everyone in this room will be very, very familiar with the decades of reports, comment pieces, commentary in general that we've had on whether we need reform, modernisation, updating, whatever word you want to use, of Whitehall and the civil service. And lots of common refrains around the types of people we have in there. Are people too similar? You know, do we have cognitive diversity? Are we getting people from different backgrounds and experiences? Why can we not do long-term thinking? Why are things so short-termist? Do we have the right skills? And that's everything from the soft skills, but also the kind of harder technical skills that we often find ourselves coming back to. Why is it so siloed? Well, why can't we do cross-government working? There's a whole series of things that people will be incredibly familiar with. So I wanted to start with the question of, why is it we haven't solved any of these? You know, is there a question of appetite for reform? Who should be responsible for driving the changes? You know, if we feel like we have quite a good idea of what the problems are and we keep talking about them, where does responsibility sit? Is there a sense of collective ownership of the corporate functionality of Whitehall? And you know, you both sat at the most senior levels in Whitehall, what would be your reflection of why we haven't achieved some of those reforms? Jonathan, if I can start with you.
Delighted to be here. Great question. So I would say, obviously, government's in charge, ministers run things, but typically they don't understand anything about the civil service or whether it's any good or not, because how would they? I mean, they generally don't know very much about their policy area. Why would they know anything about the civil service? Typically they've never run anything. So, if you just leave it to ministers, you're never going to really get any change, or you're very unlikely to, because it's just typically not their area of competence or interest. It's just the nature of the system. So that leaves the civil servants. Are they putting ideas, radical changes in front of ministers who are turning them down? No, they're not. Why do the people who run the service, people like Philip and I, of course, why does that never happen? And I guess typically because the majority of people at the top of the civil service haven't the faintest idea just how poor it is. So why would they? And of course, why haven't the people at the top of the civil service got any idea how poor it is? Because they've never done anything else. I mean, it's simple enough. PPE, fast stream, you join the UK Rolls-Royce civil service, it's the best in the world. These are all quotes from people who Philip and I worked for. So why are you going to radically reform that then? And then you get to the top of it. Well, it can't be that bad then, can it? And that's of course common aid profession. When you get to the top of the profession, you're not going to think it's very poor at choosing the people to run it, are you? I would give that as my answer.
Thank you. I said to someone at the start of this, I wonder how candid they'll be. I know they've got very strong views, because as you say, it's sit in our steering group. Well, I think we have our answer there, which is brilliant. Thank you. Philip.
Yeah, so let me preface my answer with two comments. One, and I think this is worth repeating endlessly because the civil service gets a lot of criticism, some of it absolutely justified, but on a personal basis often not justified. There are many thousands of hard-working, dedicated public servants who are good, clever, hard-working people who should be respected. I think the system in which they're now operating is not giving them the opportunity that I think they should have. I think the other introductory remark I would make is I think that what we've seen over time, and there'll be others in this room who've studied this more closely than I have. I haven't done as much of the history of the civil service as I'd have liked to have done, but I think what we've witnessed is a steady degradation of the authority of the civil service. The authority of the civil service in the interactions with ministers, its sort of gravitas, its sort of status within the constitutional framework. That's unwritten constitution clearly, so this is a thing about perception rather than changing statute, the rules, but over time, I think the place that the civil service has in the running of the country has diminished. And I think if we don't fix this, that process will continue. It's not like dramatic, it's not going to fall off the edge of a cliff next week, but it will mean that the civil service is less capable, less competent, less able to influence the function in the country than it has been in the past. So I think it's quite serious. Having said all that, I absolutely agree with Jonathan's perception of this. I think the sort of self-referential nature of the system, I think, has been a big inhibitor on reform. It's not as though there haven't been attempts at reform, and you quote in your paper, Jonathan, the Gus O'Donnell 4 Ps, Jeremy Hayward did loads on data and diversity and so on. But that reform is never, it seems to me, dropped deep enough into the system. And I think to me this is exacerbated by the things that are deemed most important, which is essentially chasing after ministers and solving the political problems. And somebody like Jeremy Hayward was brilliant at that. Absolutely, there's no question that his capacity, and I worked in Nick Clegg's office through the coalition years, and so was right at the heart of the machine when political problems would emerge, and the way that the system then functioned around it to get those sorted out was brilliant in many ways. But that meant that the time was, we were constantly chasing our tails. So there was the moments of reflection, of stepping back of saying, no, we need a deep, serious reform change programme here, which is going to occupy you, Cabinet Secretary, 50% of your time for the next 3 years, and you, Permanent Secretaries, is going to be 50% of your time, and you're just going to have to work through that. Never got close to that. So that the reforms that have happened, the change that's happened, has not got deep beneath the surface, and hence what Jonathan very eloquently described, the problems the system has.
And is that then in part because permanent secretaries don't see their primary role as kind of the corporate functioning of their department? Is it because of the types of people on the whole who are moving through? So a lot of permanent secretaries are from policy professions, similar backgrounds. You know, how do you shake that up?
Let me start then. One of the things that let me just tell you a little anecdote. Right? So I came down to Whitehall in 2009, sort of a bit starry-eyed from the chilly north, and I joined a department called the Department for Innovation, University and Skills. Do you remember that? And after, it'd be quite a big deal for me because I'd still left the family in the north, and so I was coming down to London. And within 4 weeks of joining this department, it was abolished. And it was going to be abolished. It was going to be merged with what was at the time Burr. And I remember sitting in this room with all of these DGs and the permanent secretary having a conversation about this, and the talk's very serious, earnest talk about whether this was a merger or a takeover. And I was thinking, hang on a minute, I thought you all worked for the same organisation. And I just couldn't get my head around this, the sense that this was a really competitive space, and the DS people very worried about being taken over by Burr, which is effectively what did happen. But what it illustrated to me is that Whitehall does function as a series of sort of pyramids of power, which are departments. And the primary loyalty of a permanent secretary and the department tends to be first to our Secretary of State, second, and it's sort of a little bit distant second, the government, and then a very long distant third, the country. Now, let me again just illustrate that. Why I say that, because I was dealing, of course, through a lot of my Whitehall time with the whole integrity of the UK Union and whether the UK would survive as an entity. And it was a very, very difficult challenge to get departments to pay attention to this, which again I found quite extraordinary, because the integrity of your territory, you'd have thought, would be absolutely at the top of the list of things you'd be worrying about as a centralised civil service. So sorry, long answer, but the way in which Whitehall functions, as Jonathan described, when you've shinned your way up the greasy pole to get to the top of it, that tends to be the focus, not the corporate functioning.
Just to sort of reinforce that point, and obviously,
Sorry, can people hear at the back?
Sorry,
Mine's
a bit
red,
louder.
forgive me, I'm
Bit
conscious of the
louder.
noise outside as well.
Philip is obviously right in how he started. The civil service is packed full of really clever, really committed, hard-working people. It always has been, and it's tremendously impressive the calibre of people in the civil service, and it's equally extraordinary how we waste them, and how we turn people really quickly. You ask any civil servant who arrives, I would attend every induction meeting of any new starter to my department. You turn people really quickly from people who say they've joined the civil service because they want to make a difference, and we ask them in a year's time, how's that going then? And how does what you thought you were joining the civil service to do compare with what you're doing? And they're doing a lot of writing. I'm oversimplifying, but we turn really good people into people who are just who are frustrated. And the answer I gave in that publication I produced last year was that this system will only change if you open it up. If the civil servants in this room spend most of their time in closed, secret meetings with ministers, that is the current system. That's the system for the last 100 years. That is the system. You spend most of your time in secret meetings with ministers, writing stuff that nobody is going to see, for 20 years, what would you expect that system to generate? Would you expect it to generate people who are sort of interested in the long term, in the practical consequences of their action? Or would you generate people who are really good at working out what they think their minister wants and giving it to them? Which of those things are you going to get? And there's no way that system is going to change fundamentally while it operates like that. And it doesn't have to operate like that. It really doesn't. Local government doesn't operate that way. It's a parliamentary democracy. Parliament could have something different if it wanted it. They operate differently in other parliamentary democracies.
Can I pick up on that point then about which you've both sort of made in slightly different ways, but which is the design of the system itself is the problem here. And Philip, you said, there's lots of thousands of great people, but the system, whether you say smothers them or kind of doesn't give them the opportunities or constrains them in some way. Jonathan, you just talked there very well about the kind of, your brilliant people are forced just to this very narrow kind of serving of ministers. How do we change that though? So what are the mechanisms? Is it about, kind of what you promote, reward? Is it, Jonathan, you didn't mention the word accountability, but that's sort of, at the heart of some of the arguments you've been making. Accountability to who? Is it about transparency? Is it about, I know in New Zealand, kind of you have the minister sitting in one building and you have the, on the whole, most of the kind of civil servants somewhere else, and there's a real sense that they have a separate identity and responsibility for stewarding both the government and the country. What are the mechanisms we have?
So I think there are two other things we should come on to. One is the diversity of that, and that we will talk about that, no doubt. The other is, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that Whitehall does too much, tries to do too much, and that I think is a big part of the issue. But let's do the accountability thing. I absolutely agree with you, and I think, so another example of that, in my own personal experience, I spent a couple of years working in cabinet in the European Commission, and the relationship between, if you like, the political functioning and the services was more transactional. And the sort of the holding to account the services by the cabinet was, I think, something quite interesting in the way that works. My own view on this is that we do need to turn it into a more transactional relationship and get away from this notion that permanent secretaries are somehow the sort of the key advisor to the Secretary of State in a quite a close-knit sort of way, with that relationship never being exposed to the glare of the sort of public analysis. I think that a system where the civil servants are held publicly to account for the quality of the advice that they give would be a dramatic transformational change. And as Jonathan said, this is ultimately has to come from Parliament. Now, if you do that, that does of course change the nature of the functioning of how advice system is adopted or not by the politicians. They would therefore need more support to function in terms of their offices. But I could envisage a situation where you have, as in the Barlymore in Brussels, you have all the ministers essentially occupying the same building with their cabinets, and you have this more transactional, a little bit more distant relationship with the civil service, but those civil servants being held publicly to account for the quality of the advice they give pretty much in real time. And I think that would, I mean, it sounds a bit scary, but I think ultimately that would allow the public to see what the civil service is up to. It would allow, I think, way more challenge on the issues that Jonathan has been so eloquent about, which is the relationship between that advice and what's actually going on in the world. And I think that would ultimately be healthy for our democracy. But it's a very big change.
Jonathan, you've talked about Parliament in particular and the role that they can play.
So the meeting that permanent secretaries tend to hate more than any other is the Public Accounts Committee. Because it's uncomfortable, I mean, obviously, it's uncomfortable being held to account, being asked difficult questions in a public forum, particularly if they're things that you're responsible for. That is hard. Obviously I'm oversimplifying, exaggerating, but to try and make the key point. But it changes their behaviour. It changes our behaviour. It really does. It really does. okay, I've got to put this advice to this minister, and what I think they want is poor value for money. Now, if I say that, they might not want to hear it, but if I don't say it, what on earth am I going to say to Margaret Hodge? It really does change the behaviour. If you've got to say it in public, it changes what you say. It's sort of obvious, isn't it? And you can see, therefore, and that's another reason why typically the civil service isn't going to vote for this, because it's uncomfortable. Unless, of course, you spend a lot of your career doing it, in which case it's normal. I mean, obviously there are many special things about Philip and me, which make us uniquely insightful. No, I mean, there isn't. We just joined the civil service halfway through our careers, right? We'd worked in other places for politicians who happened to do it differently. I've spoken to a number of ex-cabinet secretaries who, when I was doing my research, you said, blimey, if we'd have known then what we know now, because of jobs they've done since. Well, here's another example. A Director General who worked for me went over to New Zealand, leading on the policy for his department. He came back and he said, I think I have one meeting with my minister a week. I have one meeting with my minister a week. Because this policy that I'm leading on, do you know what, it doesn't change from week to week. And I've thought about all those meetings I used to do with ministers, several a day, which I thought was the only possible way it could be done. And I thought, what was I doing in those meetings? And the answer was, it wasn't policy, it was handling. I mean, the number of times I got asked by my Secretary of State, could I sort out the Chancellor? What? They're cabinet colleagues. And in New Zealand, the cabinet colleagues spend all their time together. And the civil services job isn't to sort that out.
Can I pick up on that point? There is a common argument that you hear quite a lot, which is, well, if we just got more private sector people into the civil service, everything would be fine. You know, it's because we need more of a commercial approach to this. You know, we need people with that private sector experience. And certainly several people, we're doing a big report at the moment looking at the barriers, and several people said to us the problem is actually the public sector is a lot more complicated on the whole than the private sector. And lots of people in the room here may disagree with me, and please do ask questions, but you know, for example, you can't just say, well, that's a bit of an awkward group, those people on benefits, we're just going to stop serving them, or you know, actually we're not going to deal with this crisis because it's a bit costly, so we're going to go somewhere else. So a lot more complicated, but you've both pointed out the fact that you need something to look at and go, oh, it can be done differently. You know, this isn't the only way. And obviously, Jonathan, you said, you know, local government is a good example of that. Obviously, Scotland is an example of different government, but doing things differently. But how do we get that broader set of experience, the comparator point, to say, but hold on a minute, this isn't the only way of doing something, and maybe there are lessons we could learn and adapt to. How do we change the makeup? How do we create that broader capacity or experience within the system?
Well, again, I mean, by admitting that the system is currently failing. I mean, this is a point that's true of any reform of anything at any time. It's not going to happen unless the people in it, or the people in charge of it, admit that it's broken. Name a single transformation of anything anywhere in the world in which the people at the beginning didn't say it was broken. It doesn't happen otherwise. So you have to admit it's broken, and it's not broken, as Philip and I have both said, because the people in it aren't very clever. That is not the problem with it. It really isn't that. I mean, any private person I've ever spoken to who joined the civil service was struck by how clever the people in it were and how hard-working and committed. And I mean, there certainly is something about the notion of, you know, not being in the club, which can be a bit irritating for somebody who joins mid-career from the private sector or anywhere else. So I mean, there is that. But typically, the sort of private sector people say to me, "Oh my goodness, why does the system work like this? This is so poor." Rather than individual people in it. And we would, I mean, how many reform plans have you and I seen, Philip, which commits senior civil servants to going on secondment for a bit? Oh my God! You know, they're either 6 months at Camden Council or KPMG, or 9 months if you're lucky, and then you come back in. I think on the day that Michael Gove's reform plan was published, a very senior civil servant said to me, and that was the latest commitment to every going on secondment, that he'd just been in a meeting with a permanent secretary asking for approval to go off on secondment. And this permanent secretary said to him, "Oh, you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. You'll that'll be bad for your career because we'll forget about you." So, if that is the view at the top, it doesn't really matter what you put in the plan. You need to change people at the top.
So again, I was just a little anecdote, but I, as a reward for good behaviour, back around just after devolution 2000, I was sent off on secondment by a more enlightened bit of the system as a civil servant, but working then for what was the Scottish Executive at the time, to work for Scottish and Newcastle. The late lamented was at that time the second biggest brewer in Europe, headquartered in Edinburgh. Everybody's forgotten Scottish and Newcastle, but did a different long story taken over by Carlsberg and Heineken. Anyway, I pitched up at this brewer, as a keen young lad, and all full of the joys of being a civil servant, very clever and all the rest of it. And I sat down with these folk, and they were completely uninterested in what I'd done. I mean, completely it was a cursory conversation, about 2 minutes, and I had to learn that I had to learn about the value that they added to their business. I had to learn about their skills. I had to learn to respect what they did. Clearly brewing is not everybody's cup of tea, and you couldn't say it was only the sort of public, the public benefit. But I had to lose a lot of my assumptions about how clever I was, because I was working with a whole bunch of folk in a very different domain who were far better at what they did than I would ever be in terms of the production, logistics, the selling of beer, and all the rest of it. And it was an absolutely salutary experience. I was meant to go for 3 months, ended up staying there for 2 years. Very tempted to stay on with them, and had a nice offer. And there was wet Wednesday afternoons looking out of the window, Victoria Quay, down in Leith in the years subsequent to that one. I thought, oh my God, why didn't I go with it? But I wanted to come back into the public service, so I did that. But and a lot of people said to me at that time, "Why are you doing this? Because we'll lose something." I thought, well, no, this is. And it was for me as an individual, I think, transformation. A very different attitude to the work that we did. But in answer to your question around, is the answer just to get a load of folk in from the private sector? No. Some, yes, but the running government is actually a professional job. And you wouldn't say, my Scottish and Newcastle experience, they weren't going to let me run the logistics network or sales. What can you do? Well, I can do public affairs for you because I know the other side of that fence. But they were, and government is a skilled professional job. So my part of my answer to this was, one is you need more flow of folk in, that's including from the private sector. I think you need to put more gates in there for promotion. I would not promote anybody into senior civil service who has not done at least 3 years in local government, health service, industry, devolved government, somewhere outside of Whitehall. At absolute bar, so that you have to have that experience. And the other thing, which is, I think people don't talk about so much, but I think it's hugely important, I would change the gates by which people come into the civil service. And as on more of the continental civil service, I would expect people to have degrees that are relevant. Law, economy, public administration. The level of understanding that I encountered around the constitution of the country in the civil service was lamentable, which is extraordinary if you think who's meant to be, thinking about this stuff, running this stuff. So, and that was not fixed by the sort of sheep-dip training that you get as a civil servant. So I would make it, particularly the policy side, very much more professional. And you do that by you've got to demonstrate you've got the attitude, the skills, the knowledge, in one way or the other, to take on the job.
Just picking up on you mentioned the policy side there, and we've had both of you reflecting on how clever the civil service is. Do we put too great a premium on cleverness? Is that part of the problem, that actually we have a lot of very bright, often initially young things coming through, and those bright young things get to the bright senior things without that experience? Why is policy, is partly policy the kind of obsession because that's the thing we prize, because again, coming back to the cleverness, and yet we always have the conversations about delivery and operations, and that's the sort of, the kind of the ugly cousin type thing, if I can put it that way, to the policy side. Should we have less clever people?
So So, I mean, ironically, the policy function is full of people with very good degrees from very well-respected universities, but they don't really know very much about the Constitution or Parliament, according to Philip. So we need to clearly want people who understand their subject well and can learn, but that isn't to be just found from people who've got a particular set of degrees at a particular set of universities. I mean, when I became the permanent secretary of the Department of Education, I withdrew the requirement for us to recruit people with degrees. You know, that for me, I mean, that's generally not the question whether you've got a degree, let alone whether you've got a degree from a particular university.
And yet most do have a degree from a very narrow set of universities.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's because that goes back, in my view, so I'm getting a bit boring here, to what too many senior people think is good. I mean, obviously it is quite hard, isn't it? Your point about the private sector to define success for a civil servant. That clearly is. It's very hard to define success for government. And that just is a lot harder, isn't it, than medium-term shareholder value or whatever you might do in the private sector. And so you get left with choosing other things instead of what's actually achieved on the ground. And so, and then it takes you back to culture. There's nothing better on this subject in my opinion than Sam Friedman, the LSE guy, not the ex-education guy, on the lack of social mobility in the civil service. He absolutely nails it. Studied neutrality, the way that a very restrictive group of people like talking to each other, the particular sort of jokes with the particular sort of classical allusions. Oh my goodness, absolutely, yes. And if you don't understand the classical allusion, and I almost never did, right, you sort of wonder if there's a sort of separate room where people are doing the work. And again, I lost count of the number of times when another fellow permanent secretary would send someone to me who wanted to get a promotion in and you know, mine was a department they get promoted into because they're interested in education. And these were people, and when you explore with them for 10 minutes, you know, what might they bring to the job? Well, they got a particular sort of degree from a particular sort of university, and they'd like a promotion. And they were pretty good at classical allusions. And you know, this is not ministers sending these people to me. This is not ministers.
Philip, this kind of the policy versus operational delivery, how do we think about that?
Yeah, no, I hear what John said about the diversity of degrees, which I agree with that. But I think my point about coming into civil service, even if it's not a degree or whatever, but that you get trained. You know how many professions you come out of university, you want to be a lawyer, you look at the medical profession, accountancy, whatever. You go through a process of professional learning on the job or off the job, whatever, and we just don't do that to necessary extent. And I think as part of that, and again, you know, the point about the admixture of skills, backgrounds, and so on. So you would aim to do that. Why not? Why aren't we bringing folk in from local government who've got? And that is the sort of like the turbocharges their career in the civil, because they understand stuff that most of the folk in the civil service don't necessarily understand. I don't like the distinction between policy and operational. I think it's sort of, and I don't know the answer to that, it's sort of a little bit too hardwired, and I'm policy and you're operational. Hang on a minute, how do you separate these things? You know, you can't, you know this, and I ran schools directorate in the Scottish government for 4 years, probably the best job I ever had, because it was, you saw that we had the whole system there. And you couldn't say, our policy had to relate to what was going on in the classroom, because if we one of the advantages of doing it in the Scottish context, we could get everybody in the room to talk this stuff through. So I never, I think that it is ultimately about government, good government. But I think so diversity of experience, more learning to understand actually what you're going into, but I think also this cognitive diversity. I think it's fascinating, this, and I sat around what is classically called the Wednesday morning colleagues meeting. You know, this is the main functioning meeting of permanent secretaries once a week. They call it the Wednesday morning colleagues meeting. I mean, it says even in the title, it's quite a lot. But the way round that table, I have to say that my background is absolutely straight down the middle, classic civil service, private school, Oxbridge, and the rest of it. So I am not, from that point of view, a great example of diversity. My bit of diversity was I carried on living in Scotland, so I was, come there. So I actually knew another part of the country. But the way in which that whole experience, whatever people's backgrounds, was a homogenising experience. There's something about living in this big city that people live, relatively speaking, the same part of the city, kids went to the same schools, and the way that encouraged the homogeneity of thought, I thought was very, very striking. There is and I don't want to go deep into this because I will go on to very, very thin ice, but there is something that this reflects the wider way in which this country functions. It's not just a feature of the civil service. I think it's a feature of our politics and much else beside. And clever people in this room who could do the analysis to understand the drivers of that and why it has given us suboptimal government, combination civil service, minister, and all the rest of it over the last, forever. I think it's a fascinating question. Just one other little hobby horse in mine. I think you can feel, as you walk down those corridors in Whitehall and so on, you can feel oozing out the stones of sort of history of the place, and that prioritising of the external, of punching above our weight in the world, of being a big player in the tilt to Pacific, of all of that stuff, is still too dominant. And when, I don't know whether you'd agree with this, Tom, but I remember sitting around that Wednesday morning colleagues table, I'd bang on about Scotland. It clearly hurts. I was really damaged by this, but and so broadly speaking, disinterest around the table. And then our ambassador to Beijing would come in. Everybody would sit there and we're absolutely fascinated by that. And I thought this is the priorities, the sort of the mental maps are just tilted in the wrong way.
But the domestic is sort of beneath the foreign kind of.
Can I just add a couple of thoughts to Philip's? There's a fun book which I recommend. It's very short. If you haven't read it, called Bluffocracy. Yeah, okay. Any of you have? By a couple of guys who've got firsts in who say the problem with the country, the reason there is a problem with our country. Its productivity is significantly lower than our OECD competitors and was before Brexit. The problem with our country is it's run by people like us, they say. And it's not just the civil service, absolutely, government, journalism and so on. So this is a broader point about the way that England, and it's England, not Scotland, isn't it, defines clever. It's a particular sort of clever, a particular sort of academic excellence, which, again, speaking as an ex-permanent Secretary of Education, I do think is quite significantly related to the lack of productivity of our country because of the way that we define clever. So that's sort of one point I make. And the other way in which I saw, and we all see and always have seen, that's why I went to speak to so many ex-cabinet secretaries to say, is this new? No. What you see at Wednesday morning colleagues typically is not a grappling of the challenges that we're facing and what are we going to do about it. Right? It really isn't. Well, it hasn't been for 20 years anyway. And I don't think it ever was, right? During COVID, we're meeting daily. A lot of people are dying every day, more in the UK at the beginning than in many other countries. You would not have got a sense watching that room of a group of people grappling with that situation and really challenging themselves and what are we going to do and is that the right answer? Da, 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 da. You would not get that sense from that room, ever.
That sounds like a good moment to open up to questions. We haven't touched on introducing a chief executive in the form of John Mazzoni for the private sector and kind of the sort of focus on the functions. We haven't touched actually that much on whether you pointed out government does too much, and maybe that's partly what stops the long-term thinking, the kind of the sort of horizon scanning, the capacity to sort of
solve some of the knottier issues. Lots we haven't yet touched on, but I do want to give everyone who's turned up this morning a chance to ask questions. I can already see lots of hands going up. I'm going to take 3 at a time. There are so many hands already up. If I can ask you to be really concise in your question, that would be brilliant. So we'll take 3 and then I'll come back. So, yep, Richard? Yep.
Thank you. Richard Harris, Associate Director of the Institute of Community Studies. My question is going to be very concise. You've talked about ministers in the singular. The minister wants this, the minister wants that. Of course, there are many of them. And as someone who in previous life was sort of grade 5 at a lowly level, shepherding pointless speeches and pointless policymakers, pointless ministers who did very little. Would part of the solution be to reduce the number of ministers, and what would happen to Whitehall as a result?
Thank you very much. And the lady just in front.
Julie Leonard and I work with Newton and actually doing a lot of work at the FE at the moment. You talked about delivery as a function, and you talked about policy as a function. I'm definitely seeing those two work quite closely, but we haven't talked about data. And I think in terms of really informing both delivery and policy, it is so incredibly core and requires a different way of working. I'd love to hear your views about what you've seen work well.
And I think I still see a hand on this side. Yes.
Hi, James Johnson, Workday. Thank you for that. Very amusing, but actually slightly depressing. And I guess the question that I'm left with is, if people of your seniority in the civil service had this level of insight into its failings while you were serving, what are the barriers that stopped you as permanent secretaries from being able to do anything about it? Because if not you, who?
Thank you so much. Jonathan, shall I start with you? So fewer ministers, is that an answer?
Certainly the system as it currently operates, and has done I think for many years, doesn't make good use of junior ministers. And so a lot of people end up doing what you described, and it's incredibly frustrating for the junior ministers too. Chris Mullin's written very well about it. You become a junior minister, think you're sort of a mini Secretary of State, and you're not at all. So I think certainly one should reinvent the system. I mean, obviously you could do away with them because they're not doing anything useful at the moment, but you could reinvent it. I mean, is 6 politicians too many to run the education system of England? No. You just would do it differently, wouldn't you? 5 of them could be the eyes and ears of the 6th, for example. I mean, but you should definitely reinvent it. And again, if you sort of leave it to ministers to come up with a new system, and you can see why it wouldn't happen, because they're just not enrolled long enough to do it. That would be how I'd answer that question. The data, yes, absolutely. I mean, the current language for the policy profession, which of course isn't a profession at all, is that they are people who convene multidisciplinary teams. That's the current language. Because if you want to achieve a change, you need someone who understands the operational implications, you need a lawyer, you need an accountant, you need a project manager, you need a data specialist. Actually, the only person you don't need is the convener, interestingly. Why mightn't the data person convene the group? But there's a group of people, and they're called policy professionals, who jealously guard on to they're the ones who can talk to the minister. They'll have a separate meeting with all the experts, and they'll report it back. How convenient. But yes, having the data specialist is important. I mean, but and it is changing. The civil service is changing. But the Public Accounts Committee, they thought they'd got me when they asked me what degree I'd got when we were doing a discussion about STEM learning in schools, and they absolutely couldn't believe it when I said I got a master's degree in mathematics. They were certain I got it. That is not typical. That is not typical. And you're right, of course. Why didn't I sort this out? Well, I did try and make the department I ran work better, and I didn't recruit any of those people with the classical illusions, and I did take away the degree component, and I inherited here's an example, an apprenticeship policy team, an apprenticeship delivery team, and I said, I'll tell you what, well, let's have an apprenticeship team. And there are 2 people who could run it. The delivery one, who knows about apprenticeships, and the policy one, who knows about ministers. And we chose the first. And we recognised that he needed to understand ministers too. And Damien Hines was the Secretary of State. He wanted to see how they did apprenticeships in Germany. So I said to the delivery guy, why don't you go with Damien then? And by the time they came back from their trip, he understood how Damien worked. It's not that hard, actually, to learn politics. It's a lot harder to learn delivery. So you do what you can, and you do, and things do get better. quite often people said to me, I see what you're trying to do here, Jonathan, but is this going to be good for my career more generally? And again, it's not, when I said earlier that we wouldn't wrestle publicly with this in those COVID meetings. I got a text one night about 11:30. I was just about to turn my mobile phone off from somebody else who'd been at that meeting that day, expressing her frustration about something that we hadn't discussed at the meeting. So we could be getting towards almost a sort of tipping point of quite a number of people. There's some tremendous people running government departments as permanent secretaries who do want to change it. Maybe my suggestion is Parliament's a bit more demanding. Maybe we could get there.
Yeah, quite quickly on ministers, way too many of them, and you send them off to open the gates somewhere, but it absorbs a huge amount of time and effort. Again, my model would be you absorb them into a sort of more political support machine for the Secretary of State, as Jonathan suggested. Got real jobs to do. They do some of the negotiating with the centre. You don't actually need them all to be MPs. You have chief of staffs. Those chiefs of staff do a lot of the negotiation collectively. You get a more coherent centre of government because they are negotiation. The right people are talking to each other. The junior ministers we had loads of them in Dexon. They came and went at such a rate I could barely keep up. I used to go and see them all when they came in, but I didn't want to invest a huge amount of time in because they'd be gone by the next. So I claim, I'm sorry about this, but a number of them have either run or now run rather important departments of state. So clearly their induction into government at Dexon was not. That's right. That's revealing some of my prejudice. But there we go. Data, yeah, absolutely. I think but there isn't. There was a moment when Dominic Cummings was sort of running. So I had this lovely vision of the sort of Thunderbirds Argo data centre in the heart of the Cabinet Office. We'd come in, sit in there, sort of direct, and then the data would come in and then pull a lever, woman, something. Of course, government is immensely more sophisticated than that. I think alongside data, the thing that really is process and systems that people don't understand. I would put a lot more emphasis on system understanding. You want to achieve a result, you've got to understand how that system functions. Now it's true in any, and if you look at a lot of failings, if failing is the NHS at the moment, there'll be funding issues, capacity issues, but I suspect at the heart of it, there is a lot of process systems issues. This is a system that is not working, and the way that it's been managed, that there isn't that right focus. The system is it's broken in different. It doesn't function as a whole. So data absolutely has to be part of that, but it has to be wedded into that broader systems understanding. Barriers to stopping. So I was 7 years at the centre. I worked for Jeremy Haywood. He was my boss for 7 odd years through DPM time and then through the Brexit time until I organised my own exit. But and I was responsible for some things, like bits of the team that led on innovation and so on, which were trying to change the way attitudes, the way we thought about policy making and so on. But the hard truth is, we were just submerged in dealing with. I never got time to look up and get my nose above the waves, and so frustrated and seeing that just desperate to try and turn this machine around what was a big preoccupation of mine through the Scottish referendum and beyond, in terms of thinking this country could break up at any minute, but never having the space to be able to step out of that and never having influence enough to get the machine as a whole to stop and think. One of the things that astonished me in a way, and I've put this in the public domain, but one of the questions I had, why didn't we see the Brexit vote coming? I cannot recall a moment in my career as either a DG or a permanent sec when the collective of permanent secretaries stopped and thought about politics beyond the next election. Where's the politics of this country going? Where are people at? What's going on out there in the system? I just don't recall us ever doing that, and I think that's extraordinary. If you think about it, we did some long-term thinking, how nuclear establishments are run and pension systems and so on, but actually the world in which we lived and breathed, we didn't really understand it very well.
And I imagine that's got something to do with how much external input are you getting versus kind of insular sort of world. I'm really conscious we are running out of time, but I do want to get more questions in. Jess, I think you had one. Do you want to go? And then I know you want to come in before. Then perhaps this gentleman here. Again, if I can ask them to be really quick questions, that would be great.
Hi, yeah, Jess Bowie, Civil Service World. I just want to come back to something Jonathan said at the very beginning, which was about politicians in general not understanding civil service, not really caring about it for all sorts of reasons, and then people at the top of the civil service not having enough delivery experience. But obviously in Francis Maude, at the beginning of the coalition, for 5 years we had a politician who really did care, actually, for better or for worse, about civil service reform. And then John Manzoni, he was very senior in a delivery role in the private sector at BP, came in as CEO of the civil service, and he wanted the civil service to take charge of its own destiny, after the Maude era. So I was just wondering, do you guys, you're sort of speaking as if those two figures, did their reforms just get squashed by the forces of inertia? Was it COVID or Brexit? What derailed that? Because those things that you were seeking did actually happen, but what's happened now?
Yep.
Good morning, thank you. I'm Mark Stanley. I work over the road in the Ministry of Justice as a senior civil servant in digital and probation. The question is, if that tipping point happened, the stars aligned and reform happened, could you say what would be different? How would it look? What would it feel like?
Yes, the gentleman just here, I think.
Yeah, so my name's Ed Hammond. I'm the Chief Executive of an organisation called the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny. I just had wanted you to sort of expand on the issue about government doing too much, particularly in the context of sort of central-local relationships and the devolution agenda. So, yeah.
Great,
just thoughts on
perfect. One that I hope we would have talked about more. So, 3 great questions there. So, maybe if I could, relatively brief answers, and then I can get another round in. So, starting with the, okay, but what about Maude and Manzoni question?
Yeah, they were both reformers and they achieved a lot.
Yeah.
Neither of them touched the policy profession.
Yeah.
That was seen as too big, beyond their scope.
Yeah.
So, the civil service is much better at project management than it was 10 years ago. It's much better than digital and data than it was 10 years ago. It's much better at procurement than it was 10 years ago. The system can change if the people in charge want it to. Everything's changed about the civil service except for policy, right? We still, the red boxes, the submissions, it's all identical, right? So that's never been taken on. What would it look like? It would be open. When I worked in local government, there were too many schools to go around in Islington where I worked. So you had to close one. It's not an uncontroversial thing. You decide which prisons to close or something, which courts to close. We had that debate in public. I went along. It was my job to advise, well, which school should close then? And I just presented that at an open meeting. And I went along and talked to the pupils and the parents of the school that I was recommending closing, explaining why. That's just the way the system works. And I make sure that advice is pretty good, right? Because I got there explaining to the kids. I'm not just working out what the minister wants. It's just open. It's just open. Or, I'm just held to account by Parliament. You would be held to account by Parliament as to whether your plans make it, what have you considered? What options have you considered? Exams, we can't run the exam system this year, it's a couple of years, if you remember it, because of COVID. Okay, there are 4 or 5 options. Education Select Committee will ask me to come along, or the relevant official. What are the options? What are the pros and cons of each of them? That's subjective, right? Have you done that work or not? Can you explain it? My view is you get a better decision at the end of it. The minister would be much better served. I'll leave the devolution question.
Yeah.
Not because I'm not interested, because that's maybe too much.
Well, yeah, more Manso, I absolutely agree. And but there's one thing, that's the permanent secretaries are probably the most non-compliant people in the country, but they're very clever at the way they're non-compliant. So John struggled with a lot of these reforms in a way they shouldn't have had to do. Maude was difficult to deal with, but actually a lot of the stuff he did was right, so I give him that credit. What do we look and feel like? I think it would look and feel more professional. It wouldn't be easier, but the debates, I think, would be, as John was absolutely open word, there would be more public debate about policy choice, policy options. And I think that would be good for the body politic, not just the civil service. Central, local, you know, like we absolutely haven't got time to go anywhere. But you know, England as the most centralised polity, pretty much in the democratic world. You look at the consequences of that, the regional inequalities, the interpersonal inequalities, and just travel, just go to places, go to, you know, go up north, and just go to some of the towns and cities that this country has left behind. And we've been trying to fix this for years, and we have failed comprehensively. So isn't it about time we tried something else? You look at the announcement this morning, £2 billion of public money being distributed across the nation by a bunch of civil servants in the Treasury and DLUC who probably have not been to the vast majority of places they're distributing money to. How can this be sensible? It is completely crackers. So, having come from a devolved context, you might say, well, it's not going brilliant in Scotland at the moment, and there's lots of reasons for that. But you look at you look at England, part of the answer has to be to break up the monolith and to have proper devolution where decision making is taken closer to people affected by it. It's democratic apart from anything else. So I mean it's all on the subject area, but it is, you know, you're sitting in sort of policy central, and that is part of the reason that a lot of this stuff actually doesn't work when it hits reality.
And that will be a massive focus for our work as well going forward, because as you say, asking people to compete, local areas to compete for funding that is then judged by central government that really tells you what to do with it is not quite what I think most of us would think of as devolution. Never mind at what level you devolve to as well, and what that means. So I'm going to take two more because we are almost at the end. So you've been waiting very patiently, and Alex as well in the middle.
Okay, so a truly innovative civil service arguably needs more permission, a different kind of appetite towards failure, and a different approach to kind of measuring things in real time so you can adapt more quickly. I did experience that from you at DfE and other senior leaders. We had more of that empowerment, but how do we make that more commonplace? How do we scale that up?
Great, thank you, Alex.
I'm Alex Thomas from the Institute of Government. There are lots of meetings at the top of the civil service, and you talked about Wednesday morning colleagues, so there's the Civil Service Board, there are lots of others, but they're rarely decision making and they're all internal. Do you think there is a place for something external to the civil service to hold it to account that isn't ministers sounding off or briefing the papers where the civil service can't answer back, but is actually a function that holds the civil service to account and runs the civil service?
Yeah, very briefly, I think again, I think transparency is where you go with. So you can put advice to ministers and say, here's your options, and these, you know, you go down the spectrum. It becomes riskier at this end, but your rewards may be higher. Intelligent policy advice, and then ministers, you know, that is exposed to public scrutiny. Ministers then make a decision on that. I think that gives people permission to do the work well. What is the evidence for that? What are the people who really matter? The teachers, the nurses, the social workers, what are they saying about this is a brilliant idea? No, they're saying it's a rubbish idea, it's not likely to work. So I think that's the way that you give people permission to do a good job. I think, Alex, and I know you're advocating a sort of more statutory sort of protection, if you like. I think that's absolutely right. Which again, what are you doing is increasing external scrutiny, ultimately from Parliament. I don't think, with the non-exec model, I don't think has worked particularly well as it is at the moment. That sort of gets absorbed into departments as well. But I think ultimately it has to be the Parliament that is exercising that scrutiny as to whether this system is functioning or not. And quite a lot of all of this, again, another big theme running through all this, is about the assertion of the legislature versus the executive. The executive is way too dominant, and this is one of those domains where I think that it's in the interest of the country for the legislature to take more interest and have more say over how the bits of the executive are functioning.
My very quick answer would be, leadership matters. Obviously, probably doesn't matter as much as leaders like Philip and I think it does. But when Gus was running the civil service, he had some things he wanted to achieve and he achieved them. So, watch who replaces Simon Case when that happens and what the agenda of that person is. And if they want to do some stuff in this space, they can. I'd like Philip, I think in order to pursue this agenda, if they were interested in doing so, it would need to be codified in statute. Parliament would need to take responsibility for it. They would need an NAO type resource to support them. But these models exist, so that's how I would do it.
It is exactly 10:30, so that was beautifully done there. Thank you. So can I first of all obviously say thank you all for coming today. Hopefully you've enjoyed that as much as I have, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. So Philip and Jonathan, thank you so much as well. As I mentioned, we are doing a huge programme of work at Reform. Simon Kay, our Director of Policy, you want to wave to everyone? He's in the room. If you're interested in knowing more, kind of want to know about the projects we're doing, please do talk to him. Otherwise, can we just give a round of applause to our fabulous